They told me I was too old to understand dreams, but they forgot. This land was my dream long before they could spell the word. For 40 years, I poured my soul into every acre, every fence post, every apple tree. And now, the very son I raised wants to take it all, served with a smile, a contract, and a deadline. They think I'm too sentimental to see through the scheme, too lonely to say no. But I've been underestimated before. What they don't know is that love can turn into steel, and silence can cut deeper than any blade. Today, they'll walk into my house believing they hold the upper hand. By the time they leave, they'll understand exactly what happens when you try to erase a lifetime of sacrifice. This isn't just a farm. It's my life, and I'm not handing it over. I used to think sacrifice was the quiet heartbeat of a good life, steady, invisible, constant. When you're in the middle of it, you don't notice how much of yourself you're giving away. It's only years later, when the house is too quiet and your hands are too idle, that you realize how much of you is scattered in the lives of others. My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 68 years old, and for nearly half a century, this farm has been the stage where my life played out. Every sunrise, every season, every ache in my back tells a story. Dean and I bought this land when we were young and foolish enough to believe love could weather anything. It was just 20 acres back then, a patch of overgrown fields and a half-collapsed barn. We slept on a mattress in the living room while fixing up the place one paycheck at a time. Dean worked construction during the day, and I cleaned houses at night. We saved every penny, not for vacations or luxuries, but for nails, paint, and livestock. Bit by bit, the land transformed. We planted apple trees along the northern ridge, built a chicken coop, and dug a vegetable garden so wide I could lose myself among the rows of corn. When our first son, Edward, came into our lives through adoption, I thought my heart couldn't hold any more love. 4 years later, Peter was born, loud and stubborn from the first breath. From then on, every decision, every sacrifice was for them. I sold my mother's sapphire brooch to pay for Edward's braces, worked double shifts to cover Peter's summer baseball camp, and skipped meals more than once so the boys could have seconds. Dean would joke that the farm was just an extension of my heart, always giving, always producing. The years were not without storms. Dean passed 15 years ago, a car accident on a rainy night that left me with 2 teenage boys and a mountain of bills. The mortgage became my enemy, an unyielding figure in red ink at the bottom of every statement. But I fought. I took in sewing, leased part of the land to a neighboring farmer, and learned how to stretch $1 until it screamed. The day I sent in the last mortgage payment, I poured myself a glass of Dean's favorite whiskey and drank it under the maple tree he'd planted when Edward was 5. People assume that once the children are grown, life slows down. They don't tell you about the ache that comes when the phone doesn't ring, or the holidays when one son is too busy to come home. They don't tell you about the way silence can fill a room, pressing in from all sides. I tried to keep busy, canning fruit, mending fences, volunteering at the library, but there's a difference between being occupied and feeling needed. Sometimes, late at night, I'd wander the hallways, touching the door frames, the worn banister, the photographs lining the walls. There's one of Edward on his first day of law school, another of Peter winning his high school basketball championship. Each picture is a fragment of me, a record of all the little trades I made, my time for their opportunities, my comfort for their ambitions, and I never kept score, at least not until recently. Lately, I've felt an emptiness creeping in, a hollow space where gratitude should be. Peter calls only when he needs something, his words quick and shallow, like he's already halfway out the door. Edward, busy overseas with his legal career, still finds time for Sunday calls. But even his voice is tinted with worry, as if he senses a change he can't quite name. I tell them I'm fine. I always say I'm fine. The truth is, I miss the days when this farm was noisy, when the kitchen smelled of fresh bread and the sound of boots on the porch meant someone was home. I miss feeling like the center of someone's world. Now I'm more like a waypoint, a stop on the road to somewhere else. And though I tell myself that this is the natural order of things, the children grow up and away, there's a small, stubborn part of me that whispers, it shouldn't feel like this. I've given so much over the years, more than I ever thought I had to give. And yet I can't help but wonder, if sacrifice leaves you with nothing to hold on to, was it truly worth it? I used to believe the answer was always yes, but lately, the word tastes uncertain on my tongue. As I stand by the kitchen window, watching the light stretch across the fields, I feel both proud and profoundly tired. Every fence post, every tree, every worn floorboard holds a piece of me. And I'm starting to suspect that the people I gave the most to no longer see the value in what I've built. That thought is heavier than any bale of hay I've ever lifted. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet resolve begins to take shape, one that I'm not ready to share with anyone just yet. Most people think life is made up of the choices they can see, the career moves, the houses bought or sold, the marriages and divorces. But the truth is, it's the invisible choices that shape us the most, the ones nobody knows you made, the ones you carry like a private scar. I have more than a few of those. Years ago, when Dean was still alive and the boys were young, we had a chance to leave this farm behind. A development company from Chicago approached us with an offer. Enough money to buy a comfortable home in the city, cover the boys' education, and give us a cushion for the rest of our lives. For weeks, I ran the numbers in my head. I imagined sidewalks instead of muddy boots, coffee shops instead of early morning feed runs. I imagined weekends at museums with Edward and Peter, winters without shoveling snow. Dean listened to all my daydreaming in silence, and then one night, he took my hand across the dinner table. "You promised me," he said softly. "When we bought this land, you promised we'd keep it in the family. This is our roots, Maggie." I knew he was right. I also knew it meant turning down security for uncertainty. But I looked into his eyes and said yes. We stayed. We worked. We poured every ounce of ourselves into making this place thrive. There's another choice I've never spoken aloud. Not to Dean, not to the boys. When Peter was 17, there was an accident. It was the middle of winter, the roads slick with ice. He and his friends had taken an old pickup into town. On the way back, they skidded into a ditch, the front end wrapping around a tree. Peter was trapped inside, his leg crushed. At the hospital, the doctors told me he'd need emergency surgery and weeks of specialized care if he was ever to walk normally again. The insurance only covered part of it. The rest, well, it was more than I had in my savings, more than I could scrape together from neighbors or loans. That night, I opened the cedar box in my closet and took out the only thing of real value I owned, my grandmother's emerald brooch. It had been passed down through 4 generations, a wedding gift to my mother, and then to me. Dean used to joke that it was the only thing in this house worth locking up. I drove through the snow to a jeweler 2 towns over, sold it for less than it was worth, and signed the hospital papers that night. Peter never knew. I told him the bills were covered by insurance. He was too busy learning to walk again to question it. I think about that brooch sometimes, not because I regret selling it, it bought my son his future, but because it was a quiet kind of loss. The kind you can't display on a mantle or tell stories about at dinner. I've never once asked Peter to remember it, to thank me for it. Maybe that's my mistake. Maybe part of the reason I feel so invisible to him now is because I made my sacrifices invisible too. If I'd taken that developer's offer all those years ago, maybe things would be different now. Maybe Dean would still have found work in the city. Maybe Edward and Peter would have gone to better schools. Maybe I'd be living in a warm apartment with neighbors I barely know. But then I wouldn't have this land. I wouldn't have the maple tree Dean planted, the apple orchard I nursed through 2 droughts, the porch where I've watched every sunset for 40 years. The truth is, I've bound myself to this place with more than just sentiment. It's a history I've been determined to protect, even when it cost me more than anyone will ever realize. As I stand at the window now, I can see the barn roof catching the last light of the afternoon. Beyond it, the fields stretch toward the horizon, the same view I've had since my 20s. Most people might call it monotony. I call it continuity. Still, I can't ignore the tremor in my chest when I think about how easily it could all slip away, how quickly someone else's ambition could erase decades of devotion. Peter calls less and less these days. When he does, it's all about his latest idea, his next big thing. He speaks in terms of potential and investment, words that feel cold in my ears. He doesn't know how much of his life was built on decisions I made quietly, alone, with no expectation of repayment. He doesn't know that his ability to run, to chase those big dreams, exists because I let go of something irreplaceable. Sometimes I wonder what he would say if I told him. Would he feel gratitude, guilt, or would he shrug, say it was years ago, and carry on as if nothing had changed? I don't know which answer would hurt more. I press my palm to the cool glass, feeling the familiar weight of the past pressing in from behind me. I've given more than I ever thought I could, and somewhere deep inside, I'm starting to wonder if it's time to stop giving. Not out of bitterness, but out of a stubborn need to hold on to what's left, before there's nothing left at all. The call came just after breakfast, when the smell of coffee still lingered in the air and the kitchen was bathed in pale morning light. Peter's name flashed on my phone, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. These days, his calls rarely carried simple conversation. They were preludes to requests, negotiations disguised as family check-ins. "Morning, Mom," he said, voice bright in a way that felt rehearsed. "Morning, Peter," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "How are things?" He skipped right past the niceties. I wanted to follow up on what we talked about last week, the farm. I gripped the edge of the counter, steadying myself. "There's nothing to follow up on. I told you before. Mom, just hear me out." He cut in, a thin layer of impatience seeping through. "Melissa and I have been running the numbers. This is the perfect time to sell. The market's hot. Developers are looking for property just like yours. We could get you a great price, and you'd still have more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. It's not for sale, Peter." He let out a small laugh, the kind that sounds more like disbelief than amusement. "You're sitting on 40 acres of land you barely use anymore. You're 70 years old." 68, I corrected sharply. "Fine, 68. But Mom, you're too old to understand how fast opportunities like this move. You could help us build something incredible. Melissa's startup idea is gaining traction, and with the right funding, then find another way to fund it," I said, my voice firmer now. There was a pause, and I could hear Melissa's voice in the background, low but insistent. Peter sighed. "She thinks maybe if you heard the business plan from her, you'd see the potential." "I don't need anyone to explain anything to me," I replied, though inside a slow burn had started. Too old to understand. The words clung to me like burrs. "Mom, this could be our chance, our family's chance, to be part of something big. You'd be like a silent partner. Your name would be on the project." I moved to the kitchen window, the view of the fields grounding me. "My name is already on something big, Peter. It's called this farm, and I built it long before you knew what a dream was." There was a beat of silence, and then his voice hardened. "You're clinging to the past. Dad's been gone for 15 years, and you're still using him as an excuse to keep everything the same. The world's changing, Mom. If you don't change with it, you get left behind." His words hit harder than I expected, not because they were true, but because they were spoken by the boy I had once carried on my hip through these very fields. I could still picture his small hands reaching for mine, trusting me completely. Now those same hands were busy drafting ways to dismantle the life I had built. "I'm not selling, Peter," I said quietly. "Then you're making a mistake you'll regret," he shot back. The line went quiet except for the sound of my own breathing. I could picture him now, jaw set, eyes hard. The same look he wore when he lost a basketball game as a teenager. Only this time the stakes were higher, and the loss would be mine. "Peter," I said, forcing calm into my voice, "this land isn't just property. It's history. It's where you took your first steps, where your brother learned to ride a bike. It's where your father and I poured everything we had so you boys would have a place to come home to. And I'm telling you, it could be more than that," he countered. "It could be the start of something bigger. But if you can't see that..." His voice trailed off into a sigh. "Maybe you really are too sentimental to make smart decisions." Too sentimental. Too old. Too stuck in the past. I'd heard enough. "I'm ending this conversation, Peter. Call me when you have something else to talk about." I hung up before he could respond. My hand lingered on the phone, trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of his dismissal. I turned back to the kitchen, the familiar creak of the floorboards under my feet, a small comfort. Outside, the field stretched in golden light, quiet and unchanging, as if to remind me that not everything had to move at the speed of ambition. I knew this was only the beginning. People like Peter and Melissa didn't take no for an answer, and if they thought they could wear me down, they were in for a surprise. I thought the storm had passed after Peter hung up, that we'd slip back into our strained but familiar rhythm of avoiding difficult subjects for a few weeks. I was wrong. The very next afternoon, a neighbor called with something that made my stomach knot. "Margaret," Mrs. Callahan's voice was hesitant over the crackling landline. "I ran into Melissa in town yesterday, at Carson and Whitman's law office." The name hit me like a cold gust of wind. Carson and Whitman specialized in property transfers, wills, and estate disputes. They weren't the kind of lawyers you visited casually. "What was she doing there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Mrs. Callahan hesitated again. "I don't know for sure, but she was carrying a folder thick with papers. She looked determined." When I hung up, the house felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. My first thought was denial. Maybe Melissa was there for something unrelated. But a gnawing certainty crept in. Melissa was many things, polished, persuasive, ambitious, but she wasn't subtle. If she wanted the farm, she wouldn't just wait for Peter to convince me. She'd look for ways to bypass me entirely. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, replaying every recent conversation. Melissa's sudden friendliness, the way she'd offered to help me understand the numbers, her eagerness to make this transition smooth. Transition. I'd brushed it off as her usual business speak. Now it sounded like a warning I'd ignored. By morning, I'd decided to find out the truth. I called an old friend, Arthur Reynolds, who'd retired from the county clerk's office but still had connections. I told him what I suspected, and he promised to make a few discreet inquiries. 2 days later, he called back. "Margaret, you're not going to like this. Melissa's been meeting with a property attorney named Benjamin Cooper. They've discussed transferring partial ownership of the farm to Peter, claiming it's part of a family partnership." I gripped the phone tighter. "Without my consent?" That's where it gets murky. They're exploring whether Peter could argue you're no longer capable of managing the property on your own. If a court believed that, they could appoint him as a co-owner or even guardian of the estate. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The idea of my own son, my flesh and blood, allowing this conversation to happen felt like a betrayal too deep to measure. My mind raced back to the hours I'd spent in hospital corridors when he was a boy, to the way I'd scraped and sacrificed so he'd have a future. Now he was plotting to take my present. Arthur's voice softened. "Margaret, you need to be careful. This isn't just about selling land anymore. They're setting the stage to take it from you one way or another." After we hung up, I sat in silence, the hum of the refrigerator loud in the stillness. My anger rose hot and sharp, but underneath it was something colder, a deep, aching sorrow. For years, I'd told myself that no matter how self-absorbed Peter became, there was still a core of love and loyalty in him. That belief had been my shield, the reason I'd tolerated his cutting remarks and impatient sighs. Now, that shield was gone. I thought back to our phone call, the way he'd said I was too old to understand dreams. At the time, I'd taken it as a jab, an insult thrown in frustration. Now I saw it differently. It had been part of the groundwork. Make me doubt myself, paint me as outdated, and when the legal papers came, it would all look justified. The shock of Arthur's news left me hollow for the rest of the day. But that night, as the wind rattled the windows and the shadows stretched long across the kitchen floor, another feeling took root. Resolve. They thought they could corner me, but I'd spent a lifetime surviving storms bigger than this. I knew how to endure, and I knew how to fight. Quietly, methodically, with the patience of someone who's tended the same soil for decades. Still, the betrayal cut deep. I found myself replaying memories I'd once cherished. Peter at 6, running toward me with a fistful of dandelions. Peter at 18, hugging me tight before leaving for college. Those moments felt tainted now, like photographs left too long in the sun, their colors faded and warped. The next morning, I started making a list, not of what they'd done to me, but of what I needed to do next. If Melissa was bringing lawyers into this, then I would too. But I wouldn't tip my hand yet. Let them think I was still just the sentimental, aging mother who couldn't see past the family photo albums. Let them underestimate me. It would make the reckoning that much sweeter. For now, I kept my routine unchanged. Feeding the chickens, tending the garden, making small talk with neighbors. But inside, I was turning every word, every interaction over in my mind, fitting the pieces of their plan together. They wanted a war over this land. They were about to get one. The first sign was the birthday party. It wasn't that I'd forgotten the date. No, I'd marked it on my kitchen calendar in bright red, the way I always did for the grandkids. Emily was turning 6, a milestone I'd been looking forward to. I'd even started knitting her a soft purple cardigan, the same color as the lilacs that bloomed near the farmhouse each spring. But the invitation never came. I found out by accident through a passing comment from Mrs. Callahan, who mentioned seeing Peter and Melissa at the bakery picking up a custom cake shaped like a castle. "It's for Emily's party," she'd said cheerfully. "Melissa really outdid herself. Pony rides, a magician, the works." I smiled and nodded, the kind of polite mask you wear when the ground's just dropped from beneath you. That night, I sat with the half-finished cardigan in my lap, the knitting needles motionless in my hands. It wasn't the missed party that hurt most. It was the certainty that it hadn't been an oversight. I was being cut out. Over the next few weeks, the distance widened. Melissa stopped calling entirely, and Peter's calls became shorter, more perfunctory, filled with vague excuses about being busy with the kids or swamped with work. When I suggested coming by for a visit, he hesitated, always finding a reason why now wasn't a good time. At church, people began to notice. "Haven't seen you with the family lately," Pastor Daniels remarked one Sunday, his brow furrowed. I brushed it off with a smile, muttering something about schedules not lining up. But the truth was simpler. I hadn't been invited to anything. Even the neighbors seemed to sense the shift. Fewer stopped by for coffee or to trade fresh eggs for garden vegetables. It was as if my absence from Peter's orbit had made me invisible in the community, a shadow of the woman who'd once hosted harvest dinners and summer barbecues on the front lawn. I still tended the farm, though my energy waned with each passing day. The work was grounding, a reminder that I still had purpose, even if it no longer seemed to extend beyond the fence line. But the isolation weighed heavy. I'd catch myself staring out the kitchen window, waiting for the crunch of tires on gravel that never came. One afternoon, I spotted Peter's SUV in town, parked outside the cafe. Through the window, I saw him with Melissa and the kids, laughing over milkshakes. I stood across the street for a moment, watching, the autumn wind tugging at my coat. Part of me wanted to walk in, to slide into the booth and pretend nothing had changed. But another part, The part that had been hardened by months of cold shoulders and unreturned calls kept my feet rooted to the sidewalk. I turned away before they could see me. Nights were the hardest. The farmhouse creaked and groaned in the dark, the sounds once comforting, now amplifying the emptiness. I'd lie awake, the silence pressing against me, memories flickering like old film reels. Peter chasing fireflies in the yard, the boys huddled by the fireplace on winter nights, Dean's deep laugh filling the kitchen. Those moments felt like they belonged to another lifetime, another woman. I tried to keep up appearances. I baked pies for the church bake sale, brought tomatoes to the food pantry, even hosted Mrs. Callahan for tea once. But behind closed doors, the loneliness gnawed at me. The cardigan for Emily sat unfinished in a basket by the window, the yarn collecting dust. What stung most wasn't just the exclusion, it was the realization that it was deliberate. Melissa was drawing lines, and Peter was letting her. Maybe he even agreed with her. The unspoken message was clear. I was no longer part of their lives unless I agreed to their terms, and their terms meant giving up the farm. One evening, as I walked the perimeter of the property, the sun dipped low, painting the fields in shades of gold and rose. I paused by the old maple tree where Dean had carved our initials the summer we were married. The bark had grown over most of it, the letters barely visible now, but I could still trace them with my fingers. I wondered if that was what was happening to me, being slowly covered over, erased, until I was just another part of the landscape people passed without noticing. I didn't cry. The tears had dried up weeks ago, replaced by something harder, quieter. I wasn't gone yet. They could try to push me out of their celebrations, their conversations, even their memories, but I still had roots here. And roots don't give way easily, not when they've spent decades holding the ground together. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day that should have been unremarkable. I'd driven into town to pick up feed for the chickens, a routine errand that gave me a reason to leave the farm. The general store was quiet, the faint hum of a country song playing from an old radio behind the counter. As I stood in line, I heard familiar voices drifting from the produce section, Mrs. Callahan's warm, lilting tone, and Melissa's, precise and polished, like she was giving an interview. It's been so hard, Melissa was saying. She's just not all there anymore. You know how it is when people get older. She forgets things, repeats herself. It's sad, really. That's why Peter and I are trying to handle the big decisions for her own good. I froze, the bag of chicken feed suddenly heavy in my arms. Mrs. Callahan murmured something I couldn't catch, and Melissa continued, lowering her voice just enough to make people lean in. The doctor hasn't said anything official, but, well, you can see it. Sometimes she doesn't even seem to know what day it is, and she gets confused about paperwork. Honestly, the farm's too much for her now. I stepped closer to the end of the aisle, my heart pounding in my ears. And that's when I saw him, Peter, standing right beside Melissa. He wasn't interrupting. He wasn't correcting her. He wasn't saying, "That's not true. My mother's fine." No, he was nodding. His hands were in his pockets, his expression a mixture of discomfort and agreement. It felt like the floor dropped out from under me. My own son standing there while his wife painted me as some doddering old woman losing her grip on reality. And he let her. I stepped back before they could see me, pressing against a shelf stacked with jars of homemade jam. My breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, and the smell of strawberries felt cloying, sickly sweet. I thought I'd felt betrayal before, but this was different. This wasn't just about land or money or being left out of a birthday party. This was about them trying to rewrite who I was, turn me into someone weak, incapable to justify taking what was mine. I left the feed by the counter and walked out without buying a thing. The crisp air outside hit me like a slap, and I welcomed it. At least it was honest. Driving home, the fields blurred past, the familiar landmarks, Dean's maple tree, the old red barn, looking suddenly distant, as if I were already being separated from them. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. How long had this been going on? How many people in town had they told? Every polite smile I'd gotten at church, every sympathetic tilt of a head from the neighbors, had they been pitying me? Had they been thinking, poor Margaret, she's slipping? By the time I reached the farmhouse, my anger had cooled into something colder, sharper. I sat in the driveway for a long time, staring at the porch where I'd welcomed Peter home from college, where I'd handed him Emily when she was just a newborn. Those moments used to be my treasures. Now they felt like lies I'd told myself to survive. I went inside and pulled out the kitchen drawer where I kept my most important documents. Deed to the farm, bank statements, insurance papers. I spread them across the table, running my fingers over each one, as if their solidity could anchor me. I knew every line, every clause, every signature, and I knew exactly what it meant. I was still fully in control. But Melissa was clever. She knew that public perception could be as powerful as legal proof. If enough people believed I wasn't capable, it would be easier for them to push me aside, maybe even convince a court to take my word less seriously. The thought made my stomach turn. My life's work, 40 years of sweat, sacrifice, and stubbornness, wasn't just under threat. My very identity was being dismantled in whispers and nods. That night, I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with only the ticking clock for company, watching the shadows shift across the walls. Anger flared, then ebbed, replaced by a bone-deep ache. Not even Dean's death had made me feel this hollow. At least then, the love had been real. But this was a deliberate erasure, and it came from the very people who should have been protecting me. Around 3 a.m, I made a decision. If Melissa and Peter wanted to play this game, I would learn the rules and beat them at it. But I wouldn't storm in swinging. I'd let them think they were winning. I'd let them build their case, confident in their lies, while I prepared the truth, like a blade kept sharp in the dark. They thought they could make me disappear. They were wrong. The sky was low and gray that afternoon, the kind of weather that presses down on your shoulders like an unspoken weight. I'd been in the attic, searching for the winter blankets, when I stumbled across an old cedar chest tucked beneath a stack of dusty boxes. It was Dean's chest, his name still faintly carved into the lid from the year we got married. I hadn't opened it in years. The last time, I remember closing it quickly, unable to face the avalanche of memories packed inside. But now, something made me kneel on the creaking floorboards and lift the lid. The smell of cedar and old paper rushed out, carrying me back decades. There were faded photographs of our wedding, Dean's worn work gloves, and the first ledger we'd kept when the farm started turning a profit. My hands moved slowly, reverently, until I found it, a small leather-bound notebook. Dean had always carried a notebook in his shirt pocket, scribbling down to-do lists, crop rotations, and half-formed ideas for improvements to the farm. I flipped through the yellowed pages, smiling at his cramped handwriting, each letter a reflection of his quiet determination. Halfway through, I found a page that stopped me cold. The handwriting was firmer here, like he'd pressed harder into the paper. The date was from the summer before the accident. Don't ever let anyone take this land, Maggie. Not for money, not for promises. It's more than soil and fences. It's who we are. If I'm not here, keep it safe. For you, for the boys. Even if they forget, you remember. I read the words again and again, my fingers tracing each line as if they could tether me to him. The attic around me faded, and for a moment I could hear his voice. Steady, certain, warm with conviction. Tears welled up, but they weren't the hot, angry tears that had come in recent weeks. These were different, steady, almost cleansing. I sat back on my heels, clutching the notebook to my chest. Dean had known. He'd known there might come a time when the world, or even the people closest to us, would try to strip away what mattered. And he'd left me this reminder, not just of the land's value, but of my own. The realization settled into me like sunlight breaking through cloud cover. I didn't need Peter or Melissa or the neighbors or anyone else to validate my worth. I had built a life here with Dean, with my own hands. The farm wasn't just proof of my work, it was proof of my existence, my resilience, my love. I closed the notebook gently as if sealing away a promise and placed it on the attic floor beside me. Around me, the chest seemed less like a box of memories and more like an armory. Every item in it, every ledger, every worn glove was a piece of my defense. Downstairs, the wind rattled the windows. I carried the notebook to the kitchen, placing it on the table where so many of our life's decisions had been made. I made a pot of tea and sat there, staring at it, thinking about how close I'd come to letting their words define me. Melissa could call me forgetful. Peter could stand there and let her. But I knew the truth, and now I had Dean's words to back me up. They could spin whatever story they wanted for the town, but I was the one living the reality. As the tea steamed in my cup, I felt something shift inside me. The weeks of being cut out, of whispers and pitying glances, had pushed me toward despair. But now, the despair was giving way to something else. Resolve. It wasn't loud or fiery. It didn't need to be. It was quiet, steady, like the roots of the maple tree outside, the one Dean had planted the year Peter was born, the kind of strength that didn't sway with every passing storm. By the time the kettle had cooled, I'd made a silent vow. I would not give up this land. Not to them, not to anyone, and if they wanted to challenge me, they'd have to be ready for a fight they couldn't win. The light outside shifted, the gray sky breaking just enough for a thin band of sunlight to spill across the fields. I stood at the window, the notebook still in my hand, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. Dean had left me more than memories. He'd left me a map, a compass pointing me back to myself, and I was done wandering. The phone rang just as I was setting Dean's notebook on the mantel. The old landline's sharp tone echoed through the quiet house, startling me out of my thoughts. I wiped my hands on my apron and answered, half expecting it to be a telemarketer. "Mom?" My heart lifted instantly. "Edward! Oh, honey, it's been too long." His voice was warm but edged with urgency. "I know, Mom. I'm sorry. Things have been crazy here. But I needed to talk to you right away about Peter and Melissa." The shift in his tone tightened something in my chest. What about them? There was a pause, the faint background hum of a busy street in whatever European city he was calling from. "I've been hearing things. A friend of mine back home, someone who works at a law office in town, told me they've seen Melissa meeting with a real estate attorney, more than once. And not about buying property, about transferring ownership." My grip on the phone cord tightened. "Transferring ownership? Of what?" "Of the farm, Mom." His voice dropped lower, as if saying it too loud might make it more real. "They're preparing documents, the kind that could pressure you into signing over your rights. If they get the right witnesses and you sign under the wrong circumstances, they could make it legally binding before you even realize what you've agreed to." I sank into the nearest chair, Dean's words from the notebook still fresh in my mind. The warmth they'd given me just minutes ago cooled into a sharp electric awareness. "Are you telling me they're planning to trick me into handing over the land?" "I'm saying they're getting ready for that possibility," Edward replied. "And I don't think they're planning to give you much time to think about it. They know you value family. They'll try to make it seem like signing is the easiest way to keep the peace." I stared at the window, the pale winter sunlight cutting across the fields. I could almost see Melissa's polished smile, Peter's forced sincerity. My jaw tightened. Edward hesitated before speaking again. "Mom, do you trust me?" "Of course I do," I said without thinking. "Then I need you to listen carefully. Don't sign anything, not a single paper, even if they say it's just for formality. And don't let them catch you off guard. This isn't just about business. They're setting a trap." I thought back to that afternoon in the store, hearing Melissa tell Mrs. Callahan I wasn't all there, and Peter's silent complicity. This wasn't just gossip, it was groundwork. They'd been softening the soil for weeks, planting the idea that I wasn't capable, so when the time came to present papers, no one would question it. A slow, cold anger began to replace the sting of betrayal. I'd spent weeks feeling like the walls were closing in, but now I could see the outline of their plan. And if I could see it, I could dismantle it. "What are you thinking?" Edward asked, his voice careful. "That maybe it's time I stopped letting them write the story," I said. "They think they're moving me around like a pawn. I say we flip the board." There was a beat of silence before Edward chuckled, a low, knowing sound. "That's the mom I know. Listen, I'm wrapping up work here in the next few days. I can be on a plane by Thursday. I'll bring everything I've got on legal protections, and we'll make sure they can't touch the farm without going through me first." A wave of relief washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone in this fight. "Edward, you don't know how much I needed to hear that." "I think I do," he said gently. "You've been holding this place together for decades, Mom. You've already fought harder battles than this. But now, you won't be fighting alone." When we hung up, I sat in the stillness, my mind no longer circling the same hopeless questions. I had a new map now, drawn with Dean's words and Edward's warning. I walked back to the mantel and picked up the notebook again. My reflection in the glass frame of our family photo caught my eye. I looked older. Yes. Lines etched by time and loss. But there was something else there too, something sharp, watchful. They thought they could use sentiment to weaken me. They thought I'd give in for the sake of family harmony. They didn't realize I was already building my countermove. Melissa and Peter might be setting their stage, but I had every intention of rewriting the script. And when Edward arrived, we'd make sure the ending belonged to us. Outside, the last light of day stretched long shadows across the frozen fields. I could feel it in my bones, the shift from waiting to preparing. The battle hadn't begun yet, but the pieces were already moving, and I was ready. Edward arrived 2 days later, his presence filling the house with a steady kind of strength I hadn't realized I'd been missing. He carried himself differently now, not just as my son, but as someone who understood the weight of responsibility and the necessity of precision. Over coffee at the kitchen table, we began to shape our plan. "We don't tell them anything," Edward said, pen moving quickly across a yellow legal pad. "Not a word about what we're doing or why. The less they know, the fewer angles they have to work with." I nodded. "We stay quiet. Let them think I'm still sitting here waiting to be convinced." He smiled faintly. "Exactly. Meanwhile, we make sure your ownership rights are untouchable. I'll file a notice of legal protection on the property title. If they try to process anything without your explicit, witnessed consent, it won't hold." It was a shield, but I knew shields alone didn't win wars. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the years I'd lived within the same walls, my routines so set they could be measured by the creak of the floorboards and the angle of the afternoon sun. I'd been fighting to keep this place, but somewhere along the way, I'd stopped living in it. The next morning, I called Mr. Donnelly, a neighbor who'd been hinting for years that he'd buy the strip of woodland behind my farthest field. It wasn't fertile land, just rocky soil and tangled undergrowth. I'd never sold because Dean liked to hunt there in the fall, but Dean was gone, and sentiment wasn't worth more than strategy now. By the end of the week, the papers were signed, and the small but solid sum from the sale sat in my bank account. It was enough to fund an idea that had been simmering since I'd walked past the empty storefront on Main Street last month. A narrow space with high windows and good light in the afternoons. "A tea shop?" Edward raised an eyebrow when I told him. "Not just tea," I said, my voice steady. "A place where people can sit, talk, remember. This town has coffee shops, but they're all noise and hustle. I want something quiet, something mine." He considered it, then nodded slowly. "It's more than a business. It's a presence. People will see you active, engaged. That works in our favor. It undermines anything they might say about you not being capable. I hadn't thought of it that way, but he was right. Visibility was its own kind of defense. The first weeks were a blur. Ordering mismatched china cups from estate sales, painting the walls in a shade of sage green I'd always loved, but never dared to use in the farmhouse. Edward helped when he could, though most of the physical work I insisted on doing myself. I wanted the shop to carry my fingerprints, my decisions, my stubborn refusal to fade quietly. The townsfolk noticed. Mrs. Callahan stopped by during the second week of renovations, bringing a jar of raspberry jam and enough curiosity to fill the whole shop. "Margaret Hale, opening a tea room?" she said with a smile that was equal parts surprise and approval. "Well, it's about time you did something for yourself." Each encounter felt like a small stitch in a fabric I hadn't realized was torn. I was building something outside the shadow of the farm, not abandoning it, but showing I could exist beyond it. By mid-month, the sign went up. The Willow Room, named for the old willow tree in our front yard where Dean used to read to the boys. It was my way of keeping him in this new chapter without letting grief dictate the terms. I didn't tell Peter or Melissa, let them hear it from someone else in passing. Let them wonder why I was suddenly harder to pin down for family discussions. In the quiet moments when I stood behind the counter arranging tea jars or wiping down tables, I thought about how strange it was to feel both fiercely protective of the farm and ready to step beyond its borders. This shop wasn't an escape, it was a declaration. I could fight for my home and still grow something new. The first day we opened, I served 15 customers. By the second week, people were reserving the corner table for book club meetings. The Willow Room was becoming part of the town's rhythm, and so was I. It was a subtle shift, but I could feel it. My name spoken in the present tense again, not as a figure fading into the background. And with each cup I poured, I was weaving another layer into the quiet armor Edward and I were building, one that Peter and Melissa wouldn't even see until it was too late. The Willow Room became more than a place to serve tea. It was a curtain behind which an entirely different kind of work was being done. While the townspeople saw me chatting with customers and pouring steaming cups of Earl Grey, I was quietly meeting with a woman named Claire McKenna, a property and estate lawyer with a reputation for being both discreet and relentless. Claire would slip in through the back entrance in the early mornings before the shop opened. We'd sit in the small office I'd carved out from the storage room, going over every detail of the farm's title, any loopholes in county records, and what legal traps Peter and Melissa might try to set. "You've got strong standing," Claire said, adjusting her glasses as she leafed through a thick folder of documents. "But they're persistent. I'd bet they'll try some version of undue influence or claim you're no longer fit to manage your affairs. We're going to make sure those claims fall apart before they can even be filed." I felt a steady pulse of something I hadn't had in weeks. Control. This wasn't waiting to be attacked. This was laying fortifications. Meanwhile, Edward was orchestrating his own part of the plan, and it was nothing short of brilliant. He suggested one evening, "I think it's time I make contact with Peter directly. Play the part of the brother who's finally had enough of you clinging to the farm. If he thinks I'm on his side, he'll talk more freely." The idea made my stomach twist, but Edward's calm confidence was hard to argue with. "Just be careful," I said. "They'll use any scrap of information against us if they suspect you're playing both sides." "Trust me," he replied. "I've negotiated with corporate sharks. Compared to them, Peter's a guppy." The first meeting between Edward and Peter happened at the local pub, a place Peter favored for its anonymity. Edward told me afterward that it didn't take much to get him talking. "He thinks Melissa's got an inside line with a developer in the city," Edward reported, leaning against the counter in the Willow Room as I closed up for the day. "They're planning to reposition the property into some luxury retreat concept, spa, vineyard, event venue. They already have sketches." I gripped the counter hard. "Sketches? So they've been working on this for months." "Longer," Edward said. "Melissa's been networking with potential investors since last year. Peter's just been the family connection to make it all possible." The realization was a strange mix of fury and relief. Fury, because their betrayal ran deeper than I'd imagined. Relief, because now I knew exactly what we were dealing with. Over the next weeks, Edward maintained his alliance with Peter, feeding him just enough gripes about me to keep the illusion alive. He'd come back from those conversations with names, dates, even partial drafts of the agreements they were trying to prepare. Claire used every scrap to preempt their moves, filing notices, updating trust documents, creating a trail of medical evaluations confirming my mental competency. The town still saw me as the woman who'd finally decided to try something new with her life. But beneath the surface, every cup of tea I poured was another day buying us time, another layer of defense being built in silence. One afternoon, Claire leaned back in her chair and said, "If they push ahead with this, they'll walk straight into a wall they won't see coming, and when they hit it, they'll know you put it there." The thought didn't make me gloat. It made me feel steady, grounded. I'd spent so long thinking of myself as a target in this, someone reacting to the blows as they came. But now, I was the one choosing the ground we'd fight on. And if Peter and Melissa wanted a war, they were going to find out I'd been sharpening my weapons in plain sight, behind a counter stacked with teapots and scones. And the letter reached them on a Tuesday morning, just as the first frost of winter glazed the shop fronts in town. Peter was the one who tore it open, standing in their kitchen with a mug of coffee in one hand and the unopened envelope in the other. Melissa leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the words faster than his lips could form them. It was from the county courthouse, a legal notice, short, precise, and irreversible in its tone. The title to the Whitfield farm had been placed under a protective legal lock. No sale, no transfer, no lien could be placed on the property without Margaret Hale's direct consent, confirmed in person with her own attorney present. Melissa's face drained of color. "What does this even mean?" she hissed. "It means..." Peter swallowed hard. "It means we can't touch it. At all. Not even for development plans." She grabbed the letter, reread it, then tossed it onto the counter like it was something rotten. She must have gotten to a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. This is airtight. Every clause covered. The rest of the day, Peter moved in a fog, the words replaying in his head. He had always assumed, deep down, that his mother's reluctance could be worn down, that her defenses were emotional rather than practical. But now, she had built a wall with steel and signatures, one that he couldn't climb, dig under, or charm his way through. 2 days later, fate staged a cruel little scene. Margaret was walking out of the post office, her scarf wrapped snug against the chill, a paper bag of letters and small parcels in her arm. The low winter sun cast her in that pale gold light that made everything feel both sharper and softer at once. She looked unhurried, content. Peter and Melissa had just stepped out of a cafe across the street when they saw her. She didn't see them at first. She was busy thanking an elderly gentleman who had held the door for her. But as she turned to cross the street, her gaze landed on them. For the briefest moment, no one moved. Melissa's chin lifted a fraction, as if ready for a confrontation. Peter's throat tightened, his hands curling into fists in his coat pockets. But Margaret? She simply paused, the faintest trace of recognition in her eyes, and then she kept walking. No words, no nod of acknowledgement. Just the steady, deliberate continuation of her path down Main Street, the tap of her boots against the pavement, keeping time with the quiet dismantling of whatever they'd once believed about her. Melissa muttered something under her breath, but Peter barely heard it. He was too busy watching the sway of that worn scarf over his mother's shoulder, realizing, too late, that she no longer carried the weight of his approval, his plans, or even his presence. The townspeople noticed the moment, too. From behind shop windows and cafe tables, they saw the split in the air between them, felt the quiet verdict being passed. Margaret Hale was not a woman to be cornered. Later that night, Peter found himself replaying that look she had given him, or rather, the absence of it. Not angry, not triumphant, just final. As if he'd already been moved to the other side of an unbridgeable distance. Melissa, pacing their living room, kept circling back to the letter. We can still fight this. There must be a loophole. No legal lock is truly permanent. But Peter didn't answer. For the first time, he wondered if the fight itself was over. If in some deeper way he had already lost, not just the farm, but the last thread of his mother's trust. Across town, Margaret was setting the last of her mail on the desk in the back of the Willow Room, humming softly as she prepared the evening's tea blends. Edward would be stopping by tomorrow to go over the final round of paperwork with Claire. The lock on the farm's title was more than a legal safeguard. It was a line in the ground, drawn with the same quiet strength that had built that land in the first place. And for the first time in months, she could walk through her days without the shadow of someone waiting to strip it away. When she thought back to the encounter on Main Street, she felt no satisfaction, only a deep, rooted calm. She had given Peter decades of her life, her care, her sacrifices. But some things, some legacies, could not and would not be given away. The next time their paths crossed was not planned by anyone, but fate. It happened on a late Friday morning, the town wrapped in the silver-gray hush before snow. Margaret had been in the bakery, picking up fresh bread, when she stepped out and found Peter standing just a few feet away, Melissa a step behind him. They looked as if they'd been waiting, though perhaps not for her. Peter's eyes darted toward her face and then quickly away, like he wasn't sure whether to meet her gaze. Melissa's mouth pressed into a thin line. Margaret stopped. For a moment, the three of them were suspended in the cold air, the street traffic flowing lazily around them. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. The paper had been folded and refolded over the years, the edges soft from time. She stepped toward Peter, her boots crunching on the salted sidewalk. He instinctively held out his hand. Without a word, she placed the envelope in his palm, curling his fingers gently around it. Peter blinked, confused, but something in her calm made him hesitate to open it immediately. The envelope was light, almost weightless. No more than a couple of sheets of paper inside. Margaret's face was unreadable. No anger, no triumph, only the stillness of someone who had nothing left to prove. She gave the faintest nod, her eyes meeting his for just long enough to let him see there was no malice there, only truth. Then she stepped back, turned, and began to walk away, the hem of her coat brushing softly against her boots. Peter stood frozen until she was halfway down the block. Then, with trembling fingers, he tore the flap of the envelope and slid out the contents. The top sheet was a photocopy, faded but legible. At the top, in block letters, was the name of a local credit union. Below it, a loan agreement dated 15 years ago. His breath caught when he saw the amount, $28,500. Attached was a receipt showing the loan had been repaid in full less than a year later. But what rooted him to the spot was the note stapled to the back. Collateral: one gold locket, estimated value $7,000. Family heirloom, Hale line. Peter's chest tightened. He remembered that locket. His grandmother's locket, the one Margaret used to keep in a small velvet box in the bedroom, saying it was too precious to wear every day. He hadn't noticed when it disappeared from her dresser. The date on the loan papers matched the week after his accident, the one on the icy bridge when he'd needed surgery that insurance wouldn't fully cover. The knowledge hit him with a force that left him dizzy. His mother had sold the only piece of jewelry that tied her to generations before her, just to keep him alive, and she'd never said a word. He looked up, but Margaret was already a distant figure, her scarf bright against the dull winter sky. She didn't look back. Melissa stepped closer, her voice sharp. "What is it? What did she give you?" Peter didn't answer. He just kept staring at the papers, the signatures, the quiet evidence of a sacrifice he'd never acknowledged. For years, he'd told himself she didn't understand his ambitions, that she clung to the farm out of stubbornness, that her refusals were born of fear. But now, standing in the cold with proof in his hands, he understood that her refusals had always been protection. For him, for their history, for everything she had already given away. Melissa reached for the papers, but Peter pulled them back, tucking them inside his coat. "It's nothing you need to see," he murmured, his voice low and strange even to his own ears. Across the street, a shopkeeper was shaking snow off a display of wreaths. Somewhere down the block, Margaret turned the corner and disappeared from view. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was hers. She had left him with no accusation, no plea for gratitude, only the truth and the choice of what to do with it. In that moment, Peter realized the victory had never been about keeping the land from him. It was about showing him who she truly was without ever having to raise her voice. Margaret's steps carried her toward the Willow Room, where the afternoon light poured warm through the windows and the smell of steeping tea wrapped around her like a second skin. Edward would be there soon, bringing the last documents to file away. The farm was secure. Her life was her own. And somewhere behind her, a son stood in the snow, holding proof that he had been loved far more than he'd ever deserved.